Welcome back. We continue in our study of the Middle Ages, and we're moving into some very important topics, and arguably the most important theologian of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas. Before we get to Thomas Aquinas specifically, we're going to look at what has come to be known as Scholasticism, which is an important development in the history of theology in the Middle Ages. And so let's do that right now and get right to it. Scholasticism is a name given to a method and movement of Christian philosophy and theology developed by scholars who came to be called schoolmen. That's where we get the word scholasticism. It flourished during the medieval period of European history. The age of scholasticism lasted from about AD 1100. You can see this is the time of Anselm, just after, to about 1600, and maybe that's extending it a little bit further than some other scholars might, because that's past the time of the Middle Ages, or the Reformation rather. So maybe that's a little bit extended on either end of those dates, but it gives you an idea. Scholastic universities awarded degrees in philosophy, theology, Roman law, ecclesiastical law, and medicine. By the way, this is the point that we haven't developed, but from those schools that were started during the time of the Carolingian Renaissance, out of monasteries or in connection with other institutions in major European cities, come the universities. Those schools developed into the universities. So by the time of high scholasticism, the times we're talking about, universities had actually grown up. Now, universities weren't like our universities today. Universities then were like just a collection of scholars in a particular location. There wouldn't necessarily be separate buildings or even a set curriculum, but just scholars around whom students would gather in major centers to study a variety of disciplines. Again, philosophy, law, and medicine, and others. Two prominent scholastic theologians were Peter Abelard, that we've just discussed in a previous lecture, and Peter Lombard, who is the author of a work called The Sentences that became virtually the textbook for theology in the Middle Ages after his time. And also, of course, we should mention Anselm of Canterbury. And of course, where we're going with this is we're going to be talking about Aquinas. Scholasticism was the method of teaching that dominated the schools, again, from 1100 to 1600. Some date it as early as the 9th century and include Alcuin and John Scotus Eriugena, who we've already seen. Many would claim that Anselm was the first great developer of scholasticism, but this distinctive scholastic text that present authorities supporting apparently contradictory conclusions, or the method of scholasticism, first arose in the 12th century with Peter Abelard's Sic and Non, which we discussed in a previous lecture. In its strict sense, technical sense, scholasticism means of the schools and refers to the way of teaching and presenting theology that arose in the medieval university classroom, which persisted until the impact of the Enlightenment patterns of thought reshaped pedagogy and the university curriculum. The heart of scholasticism insisted upon a system that was clear and definitional in tone. It was clear. It might be very cumbersome and dry, but at least it was clear. The system attempted to synthesize ideas expressed in classical and Greek writing and in Christian scripture, the writing of the patristic fathers and other Christian writings preceding the medieval period. Aristotle's views helped give scholasticism a systematic structure, but Platonism, or more precisely Neoplatonism, continued to play a large role in the enterprise. Characteristic scholastic textbooks of the 12th century confronted teachers and students with conflicting authorities. That was basically the idea. So you would conflict, you would basically take every idea, this was the idea of scholasticism, you would present authorities on either side, or you would even have, sometimes it'd be public debates between authorities. They would ask every possible question you could think about concerning a topic. They would argue both sides of it as well as they possibly could. And they would sort of think, well, that's the way for students to come to a conclusion. This was the basic idea behind Peter Lombard's book, The Sentences, the textbook of theology that gathered quotations from as many sources as possible to seek to reconcile them if possible. So that was the idea. Collect all of the authorities, compare them to one another, and then from that come up with a conclusion about what or who might be right. Scholastic masters modeled the use of sophisticated logical methods to resolve apparent contradictions. Students themselves were taught to defend their views that they did not themselves hold in disputations. So this was the technique, is argue every point as if you believe it firmly, the best you possibly can, on both sides of the question, and hopefully then you'll be able to see which side has the better argument. Apparently contradictory viewpoints were offered in order to show they could be possibly synthesized through a reasonable interpretation. The problem would be exposed, then it would be disputed in order to cause a discovery in the mind of the person who was seeking a new personal knowledge. Each text investigated had a commentary. The master would help the student read the text in such a way that he really could understand what it was saying as honestly and sympathetically as possible to get all points of view. Again, this scholasticism refers to the pedagogical method applied in the medieval university classroom, where, again, any given topic would be guided by the teacher and proceeded by means of the disputed question which lay at the heart of scholastic method. The disputed question was a question upon which authorities appeared to disagree. For example, does God exist? Arguments would be made for and against the existence of God. The teacher would ultimately offer a definitive answer and then demonstrate where the various other arguments or authorities had been deployed and on the question had been right or wrong, or misunderstood or misapplied. So you would look at everybody's argument and you would start pointing out the flaws in those arguments and why those arguments did or didn't work, all intended to be as exhaustive. You can see that this would be an exhausting method, exhaustive analysis of every possible angle on every possible question in order to make sure that you had done your best to come up with the right answer. Often, as with Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia, and we'll be talking about that in a future lecture, the argument for one side would be rooted in logic and elaborated, while the other argument would be simply a quotation taken from a particular authority. There would also be connections between questions and the overall structure of the way they're approached. So some questions would naturally lead to other questions, and so on and so forth, until you had a coherent Christian theology rather than simply isolated statements about individual doctrines. Scholasticism's strength is that it ordered and systematized previous learning, established an efficient teaching method to preserve that knowledge through the centuries. It was also used word studies and comparative logic to elucidate passages of Scripture. It should also be noted that classical and pagan philosophers, particularly Aristotle, but also Plato, Cicero, others, were frequently used by scholastic thinkers. It should not be interpreted that pagan philosophy drove the scholastic enterprise. That's what some people argue, that, well, the scholastics were just collecting philosophy. They weren't really doing theology, or they weren't really seeking new knowledge. That's not true. The point is that the scholastics would use previous pagan or Christian authors, again, to sort of make sure that you had asked every possible question on an issue, just to make sure that it was, again, complete. So the scholastics were not committed to a single metaphysical approach, although, again, scholastics like Anselm and others who followed him on that particular side of medieval theology began with faith. And that would have been true for most of them all the way through. Whether or not they were successful in maintaining their faith in the light of all of this philosophical debate is is another question, but that's what their approach was attempting to do. Scholasticism did more than preserve ancient philosophies, however. It interpreted them. It systematically discussed the problems and conflicts they presented, and an attempt to form a comprehensive, consistent view of truth, as we've said. It is hard to calculate the impact of this on the church as a whole, because this method, whether you call it scholasticism or dialectic or whatever, was something that was used for centuries, and really, as this quote says, helped shape the identity of the Western Church and European thinking in general. Scholasticism, with its emphasis on logical defense of the truth, was a natural precursor to modern apologetics. The scholastic thinkers were committed to analyzing, explaining, and defending their faith as a body of divinely revealed truths. Now that's kind of key there, because the men we're talking about are people that did believe in the body of divinely revealed truths, which is just a cumbersome way of talking about the Bible. They were like, again, Anselm. They started with faith for the most part. They were not discovering new truth, but seeking to understand the truth already revealed by God as interpreted by the Catholic Church. So scholasticism was in many ways the exact opposite of Christian mysticism, which sought for, we're going to talk about mysticism, it's sort of an intuitive kind of way of knowing God. They wanted to be completely rational and logical, but again, based upon the truth about God that they had seen revealed in Scripture. So they were not discovering new truth, but seeking to understand the truth already revealed by God. We already read that part. The crowning achievement of scholasticism was the work of Thomas Aquinas and his masterful attempt to reconcile faith and reason in two works, both with the title of Summa, and we will be looking at those next.